All right. Welcome, everyone. Such a pleasure to see you. And I know a lot of you are, facing hardships. I know my driveway is white, and I have to find a place that sells ice, which apparently is harder to find than I thought would be. So
Was full of it
was it?
yesterday. Yeah, I thought the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Good to know. Good
It's
to
the
know.
expensive blue stuff.
Uh-huh.
It works.
We'll make, okay, I appreciate that. So I wish all of you the best as, driving, getting home, and if some of you are without power or Wi-Fi, I know one of you had mentioned, good luck with all of that. Welcome once again. So among the things we are loosely looking at this in this series of talks is just the great diversity of life that is on Earth, and trying to, highlight all of the different groups. I had said this last class that when I teach, I very often will ask a class, name an animal. And what often happens, not with the smartest students, obviously, but like what often happens is people name 10 mammals, which, once again, I love mammals and those aren't wrong answers, but I just try to establish how biased we are. When we think of an animal, right, we're thinking of dog, cat, person, giraffe, elephant, where, there's 1.5 million species of animal which have been identified. Mammals make up 4,000. All right. And even among the mammals, I mean, if you're going to name a mammal, if you're going to name a typical one, name a mouse or a bat, not a dog or a cat. So, even among the mammals, we have a bias. But if you were to look at the just the weight of animals on Earth, as I'd mentioned last class, all of the wild birds would weigh that. The wild mammals would weigh that. Outweighing all of those would be the nematode worms, most of which are microscopic. Most people don't even know what they are. All right, so clearly we have a bias. Humans weigh this, the animals which feed us weigh that, so we are clearly factors in the the ecosystem. Fish, which we'll be mentioning soon, they are the second largest groups. We talked about mollusks and annelids, but today most of the talk will be on arthropods. When I say most, maybe all. So we'll look, once we start getting close to 6:30, I always want to have a backup in case we don't have enough things to say, but I think with arthropods we have plenty to say. We could talk about chordates, which are invertebrates which start to remind us of fish, either at the very end of today as a precursor to our talk on fish, or at the very beginning of fish. So it works either way. We'll see how much time the arthropods take us. But clearly, if you're going to name an animal, just proportionally, you should name an arthropod. All right, and so that's what our discussion is tonight. Forgive me, there's just a little background noise somewhere. I'm just going to mute a couple. Okay. So where do arthropods come from? They are the most abundant organisms today. When we think of ants and bees and spiders and crustaceans and crabs and shrimp, where do they come from? Well, for the longest time there were none. All right, so animal life goes by 100 million years and there are 0 arthropods. Well, then where do we come from? Well, right before what's called the Cambrian period. You look at this and you say, what is that? And the answer is, I don't know. But it starts to look like an arthropod. It's not an arthropod. All right, and there are rules. We'll get to rules. There are rules about who's an arthropod. These are not arthropods, but they're not worms either. They certainly kind of seem to be kind of in the middle. All right, so having some arthropod features, but not enough to call them arthropod. So that's who's around right before the Cambrian. The Cambrian starts, and all of a sudden we have the first major predators on Earth that Earth has ever known. These things are 3 to 6 feet long, which, maybe not huge by our standards, but the first fish were like an inch or two long. So, you're 3, 4 feet, fish which are an inch or two with no jaws. I mean, these things were terrifying. You look at the big compound eyes, you'll look at the segments. That looks arthropody to me, but they're not arthropods. Once again, there's rules. We'll get into the rules. There are wormy things, but these guys have legs. All right, so worms don't have legs, not really. Some have some parapodia, which we could argue. But anyway, these have legs, but they don't have hard exoskeletons. They're not jointed legs, which is literally what the definition of arthropod means. So if you were alive in the Cambrian, you would have seen a whole bunch of things which look a little like arthropods, having some of the features, but not enough to be called arthropods. And so it seems that for tens of millions of years, animals developed arthropod complexity gradually. And in fact, we still have a couple of these groups alive today. So if you know about tardigrades or um, or water bears, so that has more in common with an arthropod than it does a worm. But it's not an arthropod. So it kind of seems like a sister group. Like if you were to make a family tree, these are the relatives of arthropods. These guys, so we can't spend too long on them, but they're probably on you right now. And they're tougher than you. I mean that like they can survive outer space. They can survive radiation. I mean they just they'll outlive us, I guess is the short term. So they are interesting. Here is another group which are almost arthropods called the velvet worms. So point is, we were talking about all of these other invertebrates last time, these wormy things. And from this vast group of diverse, wormy things, there then gradually evolves the features of the arthropods. Now, when I said there are rules, there are. So if in biology, if you're going to use a word, somewhere someone has written down what that word means. All right, and we'll get into this because like when we start talking about the bugs, we'll say, all right, you're a bug in the butterfly group. Well, what does that mean? All right, well, we'll say, well, there's this order Lepidoptera, and here's what you need to be part of that group. Oh, and then there'll be a suborder, and then an infraorder, and then a superfamily, and then a family. And each of these has rules. You just don't look at a bug and say, it's a butterfly. All right, no, it's you'd have to do the checklist. Butterflies have these traits, beetles have these traits, etc. So arthropods the same way. You I don't want to go into this all, but you don't either. A lot of the arthropod stuff is the fusion of the mouth parts. See, arthropods have segments, and segments can smush together, and the arthropod head results from like a whole bunch of wormy segments that used to be in a row that just kind of like smush together. So the arthropod mouth is just like crazy little detail stuff going on. In addition, they get a hard exoskeleton. Now, hard exoskeletons great for defense, but obviously it makes it tricky to grow. All right, because like even like hermit crabs, like once they get bigger, they have to kind of get rid of the snail shell that they stole and then go find a slightly bigger one. Well, here you'd have to shed your exoskeleton. And then as you expand, to make a bigger size, now you're vulnerable because your exoskeleton hasn't hardened yet. So predators can get at you. All right. So an exoskeleton is one of the features. Ooh, Etruscan shrew. Oh, good. Etruscan shrew. That's a good animal. Good call. The name arthropod literally means jointed leg. All right, so a lot of invertebrates don't have legs. All right, clams, worms, etc. But not only having legs, but jointed legs, which was what some of those Cambrian animals lacked. Now, one of the things that a lot of animals figured out, the earthworms did, the arthropods did, if you segment your body, it's a great way to cheat. Like, let's say you're trying to write a term paper or write something like writing something that's long. That could just take forever until you realize there's that copy paste, button. Because if you can like copy paste, copy paste, copy paste, all of a sudden you got a long thing. And so that's a neat way to make a body. All right. So yeah, somewhere there's a millipede. Let me just see if I can get it really quick. Millipede, where'd you go? All right, so like millipedes, ah, it's like we'll find you somewhere else. So clearly, each part of this animal's body is not a separate invention. It just said, hey, let's copy paste, copy paste. And all of a sudden you got a body, all right? And if you've got these jointed legs, well, just copy paste and they can be these generalized legs. But then in specific areas, you can say, ooh, you would be really good for prey capture. You would be really good for, swimming. You would be really good for these other things. So once you got segments and these jointed legs, there's so many options which are now open to you. Okay. Invertebrates have eyes. Eyes go back a long time, and there are simple eyes. All right, invertebrates had them since jellyfish, and arthropods can have simple eyes. But another thing that arthropods can do is then put a whole lot of little eye pieces together, these hexagonal units known as ommatidia to make what's called a compound eye. So if each acts as kind of like a separate camera and kind of takes a picture of the world, that together they can create a more accurate picture. So there's a big compound eye that's made of lots of those little units, and these go way back to the trilobites way back when. Now, we cannot spend much time on arthropod classification because half of all known species belong to just 4 groups of
Renata,
insects. Like
can I
these are
call
the
you back?
most
I'm on
abundant
Zoom.
animals
Okay.
in terms of number of species, in terms of just biomass. So, classifying them, you would spend the rest of your life. And just in all honesty, there was once upon a time I was living in South America and decided to do a little experiment. I gathered a bunch of like bugs and little spiders and things that were living in the leaf litter. And I took them to a friend that was living in the capital who was doing biodiversity. And I'm like, wouldn't it be cool if like I discovered a species? And I like took him to him and I showed him all these little things. And he's like, what? Yeah, you got some new species here. And I'm like, this is awesome. What's the next step? And he's like, well, the only 2 people in the world who could confirm this is this one guy in Buenos Aires who has a year backlog, and this guy at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., who doesn't answer our calls. And so I said, all right, we'll take them then. And so there's just so many of them that clearly we can't do justice to this group. But if you were to try, one of the first things you do with the arthropods is you ask, what kind of mouth parts do they have? All right. And so therefore you would say, ooh, the mouth parts of scorpions don't look like those of bugs. All right. And so we have different groups where in general, at least to start off, they either have chelicerae or mandibles. So if you were to look at this scorpion and say, what might mouth parts look like? Those are weird looking mouth parts. All right. That's what we call chelicerae. Now, these chelicerae can actually grasp. Spiders tend to have just kind of pointy ones. All right. But that would then put them on one half of the arthropod tree that would have like spiders and trilobites and horseshoe crabs. Whereas those which have mandibles would include, here's a termite. Like that looks different. It's more for crushing. Now, because there's so many insects, like no one rule applies. Like, so if you say birds can fly, well, some have modified that like penguins. So we could certainly find, that insects which subsequently modified their mouth parts. But the first thing we would do is say, all right, well, we got the Chelicerata group and we got the Mandibulata group. The Chelicerata group includes, oh, I'm sorry, I showed the picture, so we might as well start. It's going to start with you guys. So since we're here. The state fossil of New York is the sea scorpion, the Eurypterium. Some of these could get to be 8 feet long. All right, and here's what I mean by chelicerae. Clearly, that's a different type of mouth part than you would associate with most arthropods. Now, not only is that a scary animal, that remember a lot of the fish at this point were much smaller and had no jaws. All right, so there was a while where there were vertebrates, but the invertebrates ruled. All right, these were the dominant ones here, and so these are simply incredible things. And these are scorpions. Scorpions started in the ocean. They had this little offshoot that lives on land in the Paleozoic. But then there's that big mass extinction I mentioned last time where 90% of life dies out. And that includes all of the sea scorpions. And thus scorpions today are represented only by that minor little branch of the family tree, which had made it out onto land. So we could go on and on about sea scorpions. Certainly fascinating. Trilobites, perhaps worthy of even more conversation. Trilobites have a cousin that's alive today called the horseshoe crab. So here's a horseshoe crab that has this really hard outer casing, its carapace, but then a bunch of generalized legs on the bottom, which they can use to swim, to burrow, to crawl, etc. So, okay, yeah, I'm sorry. That was just on the legs. So if you wanted to get an idea of what trilobites look like and how they lived, this is a really good approximation because these are their closest living relatives here, the horseshoe crabs. Trilobites, they were the dominant thing 500 million years ago. Trilobites were everywhere. And they're in Orange County as well. One of the the members of our talk from last week came up afterwards and just emailed me today and said, you know, on my property, I have some fossils that have trilobites. And I think where they live, I don't know if you know this, and I don't like to spread it because there's nothing, what I'm about to say is like public land, like, oh, it's a public park, you can go and dig up your own trilobites. It's like private property. So like but if you're going down 84 and you're almost at Port Jervis, there's like a ridge on the one side that many people just call Trilobite Ridge. It used to be a reef. You know, Orange County was the bottom of the ocean. And there are places in Orange County where you can find trilobites. And the gentleman who was here last week, I'm excited to get to know him. And if you're listening, I'm sorry, I didn't check through all the people online. I did talk to our geologist. We'd love to meet you, and then maybe check out the rocks that you were referring to. They were everywhere. There were thousands and thousands of genera of um, of these things. So arthropods are here, and they're here to stay. They're a successful group, but then the extinctions start. And so, the Paleozoic era, I mentioned this last time, sorry, the Flintstones lied to us. All right, I mean, they had everybody living together. Look, the dinosaur, the pterodactyl, the saber-toothed cat, and it just wasn't like that. Not even all the trilobites lived together. Like I have so many videos. I'll just mention this, but if anyone's really interested, I could find videos just on this. There were trilobites that lived in the Cambrian period. There were trilobites which lived in the Ordovician period. And then there was a mass extinction. A lot of them died. But then there were trilobites which lived in the Silurian. There were trilobites that lived in the Devonian, like the ones you can find in Orange County. But then there was a mass extinction then, and a lot of those died. And so by the end of the Paleozoic, they were just barely hanging on with a couple of groups. So they were around for 250 million years, but they didn't all live together. All right, so you could find all of these different groups at different times. So fossil arthropods, there are so many of them. And because I'm biased, I like to talk about the big ones. But like today, when we think about crustaceans, I mean, just the biggest animals alive today, a lot of the whales, baleen whales, they eat the smallest. I mean, they're filter feeding the little crustaceans in the water. So we can't disregard these guys. These are, the basis of so many food chains. I mean, we think of shrimp, that we like a great deal, but so many little fish. This is what they're eating. If we get through, actually, you know what? That's completely my bad. It's a whole nother. I have more playlists where I could like show you here, but yeah, I should have definitely showed you this. All right, so while I mention the topic, let me just. So when we talk about arthropods, if you were of the mind, wouldn't it be like what kinds do we have living in Orange County? Before we get to the insects, I mean, one of the things you could do is you could just get a little, fish net that you buy for $1 or $2, and then just go to your nearest pond, and you would see so many. So we just don't have time. Sorry. We don't have time to go all through all of these. But if you were to just look at some of the little critters that you would find in the pond outside your house, and most of this video is shot from animals which were caught like in this little pond right here. And I want to do that because this little pond out here is nothing to be like overly proud of. Like, it's not really pristine by any means, but just to show you how diverse the life could be just in this thing. So like the pond near your house, just imagine. All right, so here's this group of little water fleas called brachiopods. Here are Daphnian, also known as water fleas. All right, so we got those. They're carrying around their young on their back. So, these little things you can barely see, but they're good parents. Right. Here we have these little things. They look like clams. Like I always think they're clams until you see the legs stick out. So it's an arthropod that just has like this little clam-like shell that it would come out of. Then there are the copepods. There's like these little guys. A lot of these live in the ocean. There's amphipods. If you're wondering why they all end in pod, that's the Latin word for foot. And then so amphi means there's two kinds of feet that do two different things. Amphipods have different kinds of feet. Isopods, iso means same. So isopods, all their feet would be the same. So I could go on. So these are just some of these little tiny little arthropod groups which live all around us in ponds. You probably don't care, but the fish do. And then the birds that eat the fish do, because, obviously the food chains have to start somewhere. So they're eating the bacteria and the algae, and then the fish can eat um, eat those. Obviously, we can start to get into bigger groups of arthropods, plenty of crustaceans. So in our area, the biggest of the crustaceans would be crayfish. All right, so you can find little ones in ponds near us. They can certainly get to be bigger. And so if we were to look in the fossil record, we have fossils of the early crustaceans. We have fossils of all of these things, and they will make it out on the land. If you don't mind, I'd like to kind of get through all of the arthropods before we get to insects and spiders on land. But one of the neat things about them is a lot of them, especially the crabs, they can do both. They can breathe oxygen from the water, so they can go underwater. You can see the waves going over them. But as long as they can keep that membrane moist, they can breathe on land as well. There are crabs which spend almost all of their time in the water. There are crabs that spend almost all of their time on land. And so scorpions started as marine and they make it out on the land. So did the ancestor of spiders. So did the ancestors of insects. So a bunch of arthropods start in the ocean and will make it out onto land. And crabs are just brilliant at showing us, you could be transitional in between and do both. Oh, and I'm sorry, I said so once again, I have this video which will kind of say, these trilobites are known during this period. These trilobites are known during this period, etc. So there are all of these fossils. But before we get to the insects, just mention the ones which are still around with us today, like the spiders. So spiders have not always existed. So if you were to go way back to the Cambrian, you would find things which were like, related to spiders and scorpions, or, just not in one of the two groups, but relatives of both. You come back a little later and you're like, well, it kind of looks spidery, but more like a mite. All right, so like more like a mite type of thing living on land. They don't have spinnerets. They wouldn't make silk. You come back a little later and hey, we have things that look like spiders. They're not quite spiders because they make silk, but they can't spin it. All right. And so if you ask, when we think of spider silk, I'm sure you're thinking of, this complex web, which you can use to trap insects. Yeah, but it can do so much more. It can like cover your egg sacs. All right. Even if you were going to use it for prey capture, what the most primitive spiders do, they don't make fancy webs. That's only the more advanced groups. They just make tripwires. So like a spider will just kind of like hide in a hole and it'll put this web little trip line and then a bug comes crawling along. It trips the thing and the spider comes out and jumps them. So once again, this making of silk webs developed in stages. All right, we can see it in the fossil record, and we can see it in the spider groups alive today as well. Now, I mentioned spiders, and so yeah. Oh, okay, yeah. So spiders belong to a group that has, they have cousins, mites, ticks, things like that. And so, yeah, leave that a little bit. So if you were to turn over a rock, they're like everywhere. See that little red thing crawling along? All right, so that's spider-like, but it's not a spider. It's a cousin. So there are lots of places, and once again, important in food chains, eating lots of these little tiny things. Ticks are also in this group, which are spider-like. There are some bigger ones. That's unfortunately a deer tick, so that's smaller ones. Right, and then we have spiders. Now, harvestmen, we call them spiders, but they're actually, once again, cousins of spiders, not really spiders. So the daddy long legs, they're in the same group. So we got mites, we got ticks, we got a bunch of things. We got harvest men, and they're their own separate. They're their own separate group. Insects, you may know, have like 3 body segments. Here, they have a couple which are fused. So they have a cephalothorax and their abdomen is fused. So spiders have 2 body parts because 2 are fused. These guys just have 1 because they just all smushed them all together. All right. So, these are interesting. And I think they're here. I know there's, there you go. So this is a member of the group. But if you look, can you see this little red spot? That is a mite, which is a parasite on the harvestman. All right, so here you have some of these guys, preying on others of these guys. So there's relatives of spiders in the world. All right, and then there are a great diversity of spiders. I'll just, show you a couple that in our area. Some fish, all right, so they can actually go underwater. They can actually prey on things which are under water. We've got wolf spiders, all right, which are hopping. These guys won't make webs. They're more just like a hunting spider that'll just kind of run around looking for prey. And once again, if they make silk, you can put it around your eggs. You can use it, in mating. So there's lots of things that you can use silk for. There can be pretty colors in spiders. So orchard spiders have a nice little greenish hue as they try to blend in with some of the fruits around them. Long-jawed spiders, which you'll see here, you can see in a second. Just their mouth parts are longer than the chelicerae, are longer than what we see in most groups. And a lot of spiders are really tiny. So this is if you know what fleabane is, it's a little white flower. And if you look at the tiny petals, really close, there's a little tiny spider that's going to try to feed on the insects which come to pollinate here. So, of these different groups of arthropods, a great diversity.
Is that why it's called fleabane?
Oh, so I'll tell you what I heard. So I heard it, so it must be true. So in the old days, they, the whole idea of like disease and stuff like that, and like fleas, like where that comes from, people believed in spontaneous generation. So like you just leave like sawdust out and get damp, and that's where mice come from, etc. So where fleas came from, like nobody knew. And so fleabane was thought like you would put this in your bedding because before there were mattresses, you would just you'd want to sleep on something soft. But if you use plant stuff, like it would be full of just bugs and stuff, so you have to change it every now and then. So if you put in these flowers, it was called fleabane, with the idea that would lower the numbers of fleas and other things. But then they figured out that washing the sheets would work too, and I think then this decreased, and it's so that's the story that I hear. Did you have a question? Or? Oh, no. Feel free to wave at any time. That's good. I'm sorry, your hands up. I'm sorry. No, my bad. I didn't want to not answer your question if you have. So that was the one part of the family tree. Oh, I'm sorry. I forget these guys. So crustaceans, most of them live in the water, although there's a group which isn't entirely terrestrial, but pretty darn close. They're called woodlice or sow bugs. A lot of people call them roly-poly. So if you turn over logs, you'll see these little gray things running around. These are actually crustaceans, and among the crustaceans, the ones which have best adapted to life on land. Okay. But then there's the other part of the arthropod group that don't have the chelicerae, but they have the mandible mouth parts. There are millipedes. Millipedes tend to have 2 pairs of legs per body segment, and they tend to be herbivores. In the fossil record, some of these could get to be 12 feet long. Now, I know that sounds crazy, but this is like a bit of an aside, so I'm sorry. This is quick. Right now, not a whole lot of green stuff is at the equator. All right, so if you look at like where the equator hits the Americas, like it kind of hits like South America at a narrow point, Central America is really narrow. So it's not like a big fat part of a continent. Where across is Africa, it's a desert. So you don't have at the equator huge land masses full of green trees, but you once did. All right, so 350 million years ago, when Orange County was first starting to rise out of the ocean, we were close to the equator. And then, like, the fat part of North America was there. So when there were trees everywhere. That's where the coal forests come from. Just like that's why, Scranton, Pennsylvania, you can still go to the coal mines there. That's the remains of these huge expanses of trees. Well, they kicked out an awful lot of oxygen. And at that time of Earth's history, Earth had more oxygen than it has ever had before or since. And so the bugs got bigger. Like if you got plenty of oxygen in the air, their lungs aren't as good as ours. But the higher the oxygen, that advantages. So there were spiders which were this big. There were dragonflies that had 3 foot wingspans. There were millipedes which were 12 feet long. The Carboniferous period is called Carboniferous because of like the coal reserves which were laid down. That was also a banner day for the insects. So millipedes, centipedes are their relatives. Centipedes tend to have one one pair of legs per body segment, and they tend to be carnivores. So millipedes are really cute. You can hand them around if you're leading a scout troop. You can say, "Oh, here, hold this." You don't do that with centipedes. They bite and it hurts. All right, so just make sure you know the difference before you start doing that. And then there's a weird group you can find in our area that's actually, they're also relatives. So these are these little tiny whitey things in there. All right. So they're kind of like relatives of both millipedes and centipedes. All right. So they're on the other half of the family tree. Yeah, we want to go here. Not only that, we think they were the first land animals. So if you say, who were the animals on land? Amphibians, they'll come a little bit later. We think it was them. All right, we think it was the centipedes and the millipedes and their kin. Like we find little footprints of them and stuff like that before there's any other land animals. So we think they come first. And we think that from them, we get the insects. Now, I do want to talk about insects because there's like a gazillion, but just let me do history of them a little first, and then we'll get into some of the diverse groups. When insects first appear in the fossil record, they're weird. All right, they're not the kind that we know. There are no ants, there are no butterflies, there are no beetles. They come much, much later. All of the early ones are wingless. Now, today there actually are some wingless insects. I'll show you in a second. But all of the first okay, let me go here. I'm sorry, I've got like so many things open. There we go. I should be able to find it. I hope I can. It should be here. No. All right. Where's my wingless insects? All right. I'm sorry. I'll show you. Oh, there we go. Now, this is actually, if you get a chance, like this is actually amazing because like maybe 3 weeks from now, let's say it starts to get a little warmer in March, and maybe you're walking along the road, there's like, you're walking along a path, there's still snow on one side of a certain amount, you can see snow. And if you look down, you'll see like all these little spots. You'll see millions of them. All right, so these are what are called springtails. That these little things that come out of their butts that hook into thing here. And if you scare them, what they do is they like let it loose and it slams on the ground and it like pops them back and they like avoid our predators. So there's like it's amazing when you think of it, you're looking at millions and millions of living things. Now they'll remain there in the rest of the year, but they'll just be in the leaf litter, etc. When we think of salamanders, like that's what they're eating. But these are wingless insects. Here's another type of wingless insect here. So we still have a few wingless insects alive today, but it used to be they were the majority of the insects. By the Carboniferous period, we were actually getting some insects with wings. At first, they couldn't bend. Like, so maybe it was like kind of like a hang glider, like a bug would like climb up really, on a plant and let the wind catch it and just kind of like steer however it could. And so bugs would go through a couple of different stages with their wings. But then by the end of the Paleozoic, we have a whole bunch of bugs. Now, bugs will change over time. The first bugs were mostly sucking bugs. All right. And by that, like leaves make fossils. And it took a really long time before leaves had chew marks on them. It took bugs a while to figure out that they could chew leaves. For the most part, what they did was they had like sucking mouth parts that would like just like try to suck out the sap and then suck the stuff out of leaves. Now, some bugs still do that today, but in the old days, most of the bugs do that. Today, it's a minority. Most of the bugs have chewing mouth parts. In this group, all right, there were just things that looked like dragonflies that weren't. Some of them they were cousins. Some of them could get to be have 3 foot long wingspans, and we refer to them. Go back here. So if we were to like make a family tree of of the insects. Of the ones which have wings, some can't fold their wings, like dragonflies. They hold their wings out here. They can't fold it the way a beetle could or the way that a bee could. And so we refer to that as a more primitive way. So the dragonflies and damselflies, they have their ancestors come from the Paleozoic, whereas like beetles and flies and butterflies, they're the age of dinosaurs. They come tens of millions of years later. And there's a lot of them in our area. And this is becoming kind of a cool thing. Like just like there are bird books, you can get, damselfly and dragonfly identification books. There's all of these different kinds that are nice. Now, when it comes to bug identification, I like it, but sometimes you just have to give up. And so with some of those damselflies, you can say, aha, I know what kind you are by the color. I know what this, but like then other times you can't because there's a whole bunch of different species that look like this. And if you ever get into this, and I am really not recommending that anyone does. If you try to identify bugs, at some point you're like, all right, under your microscope, look at the third joint on the metatarsal, and if the spine is more than the width of it's not something like oh, that's a cardinal. It's not like that at all. Which is getting back to why that one no one could identify those little bugs. You need to be an expert in a group. All right, and for a lot of the ones from the tropics, you don't have books. Like you can't say, oh, let me look up what species it is. Not in Costa Rica, not in Ecuador. There's no books on Brazilian this or Malaysian. There's there are starting to become some, but of the damselflies, some are bigger than others, different colors. This one has a metallic sheen. They live in different habitats. This one likes running water. So if you're near a slowly moving stream, you can find the ebony jewel wing. But if you're by a lake, you won't. All right, so just like birds, like if you're a bird watcher, I want to go see this bird, I'll go to this habitat. Bugs are like that too. Okay. And there's a whole bunch of, these different damselflies, and the same thing with their cousins, the dragonflies. So many kinds, all right? Some are big, some are small. All right, so you can just see so here, the Eastern amberwing, here's kind of a smaller one that we find in our area here. And something this one, at least in New Jersey, not endangered, but like approaching that, and then so as we look, some of these things are more common than others and something we're watching. Same thing with the insects. With both the dragonflies and damselflies, their larvae live underwater. So when a egg hatches, it doesn't look like that. All right. Instead, so here you see dragonflies laying eggs. And what they do is often the males and females, they'll hook up where the male's tip of its tail will anchor onto the female's head. They'll transfer sperm. So here you can see it's a male in front, a female in back. The tip of her abdomen will pick up sperm that he releases. She'll fertilize her eggs. So A, that's a way to mate. But B, they're going to lay their eggs in the water. And while a female can do that on her own, it just is so much better if you're anchored to someone who's like flying and kind of stabilizing you, especially like if a predator comes and you have to take away. So they lay their eggs in their water, and this is what a baby dragonfly looks like. And when I say baby, like a lot of us think, like, oh, like it's the moth, that's the big part. The caterpillar, not as important. Like this is not as important. A lot of insects spend most of their lives in the larval phase. All right, a lot of the adults are just to have sex and lay eggs and then die. A lot of adult insects don't even have mouths. Like a lot of moths, they don't have mouths. Their job is not to eat and live long. Their job is just the caterpillar ate for years, maybe, got big, all right, and now produces adult form that's just going to be mobile and spread around, have sex and die. So a lot of dragonflies, most of the lifespan might be spent in this. They have an extendable proboscis here, and they can prey on fish. So they'll just sit there camouflage. A little fish goes swimming by. All of the thing shoots out, and it has these, barbs at the tip, which grab baby fish and the like. And just like you can distinguish between different kinds of adult dragonflies, same thing with these guys. All right, so these are the dragonfly larvae. Damselflies also have aquatic larvae. They breathe from the tips of their tails. Damselflies have three little gill filaments. Dragonflies kind of suck water into a chamber where there's a lung, so they just essentially breathe from their butts, the two groups of these. All right. So we have a great diversity of these guys in our area. If we were to just like start going on, all right, how do we want to pursue this? We mentioned aquatic larvae. That's actually a thing. So if you start scooping up water, there's a little baby damselfly, right? But there's all of these things like so here's a fly. That's a mosquito, obviously. Uh, this is what's sometimes called a bloodworm. That's another type of fly called a midge. There's another damselfly. So look how different that one looks. Like just like you can identify the adults, you can identify the larvae.
Yeah.
But so here, for example, this is what's called a caddisfly. All right, but that's what the adults look like. Here's what the young look like, and they live in water. Here's a stonefly. That's what the adults look like. But if you go to the Delaware River, overturned rocks, you'll see these little flat things going up here. There's different kinds of flies that can have this. If you're a fisher person, Dobson fly larvae that look like this are very popular to sell as bait for fish. So as we start looking at some of these, there's mayfly and stonefly larvae. So there's lots of different groups that they lay their eggs in the water and their adults come out on land. So a lot of the really big groups of bugs alive today have 4 stages of their life cycle, like a butterfly and a caterpillar. So there's the egg, there's the caterpillar. The caterpillar forms a cocoon, third step, and then you come up with the adult with the wings and all. These have 3 stages of their life cycle. They have an egg, then they have a larval form, often living underwater, and then that'll just kind of break through a case one day and then be the adult dragonfly, which can fly, or the adult mayfly, or whatever. Now, there's all these reasons to be interested in these things. I mean, if you're a fisher person, if you fly fish, you are, when the mayflies are coming out. Some of these will only live a day. Once again, their larvae last, a whole year, but their adults are just to have sex and to lay eggs, and that's it. So one day is what a lot of the mayflies live for. And when there's mayflies out there everywhere, and so then the trout are going crazy because there's just all these bugs on the water, they're eating them. So if you're a fly fisher person, all right, you're saying, I'm going to use this fly that I tied specifically to look like this species of mayfly, which is out now, and I'll use the other one, which is going to be out later. Some people study these for reasons like, if I were to say, ooh, look at these 2 things I found in the pond near me, you'd be like, all right, well, they kind of live everywhere. Even if the pond is polluted, you'll find them. Whereas if you said, ooh, I found this, you'd be, ooh, that's a good quality stream. That's relatively uncontaminated. So if you were presenting to your town board whether you think that the building development in your community, and this is actually going on, this true story, is like contaminating the water, you would maybe do an invertebrate study and you'd say, which invertebrates am I finding in the stream? I've seen a loss of some of the ones which are really sensitive to water pollution. And so, we're going to now try to modify how much building we allow in our area as a result. So just a point that a lot of people study art, these things, not necessarily because they think they're the be all end all, but there's all of these different possible applications of learning about them. There are all of these different groups. Let me kind of start off with the ones which come before the dinosaurs, and I'll get into those. Some resemble sticks, and we can actually have them in our area. And then there are the mantises. Okay, that's another older group. All right, just fascinating when we consider invertebrates. A lot of the worms are kind of boring, but when you look at just what you can do with jointed limbs and how you can specify them, just like all of the options that you have, I'll tell you. We have 2 mantises in our area. This one belongs here, the Carolina mantis. This one doesn't. It's an invasive species. So that's another reason a lot of people are interested in, like, there are invasive species of plants that we're monitoring. There's an awful lot of invasive species of insects. All right, and so are they becoming more common? Well, just a lot of people, well, let's monitor, this species and that species. Unfortunately, I have a lot more to show you of those. Dobson flies, they have huge mouth parts. They're not really for biting, it's more for prey capture and even some mating. This is a male. Females are pretty sizable too, but they tend to be thicker. And like I said, there's the larvae. And fisher people love using them as bait. All right, so if you fish, I'm sure you know that one. There are cicadas. Now, there's different kinds of cicadas. There are cicadas which we have every year, all right? Very noisy and just cicadas. Oh, everybody loves to eat cicadas. I mean, if you're a bird, if you're a wasp, we'll get to wasps. Everybody loves cicadas. And so there's actually a wasp that's called the cicada killer. We'll get to that one. But then there are the ones that realize, hey, they love to eat us so much that if we were out in the same percentage every year, that the predators would then, eat a lot of cicadas, have lots of kids that would eat lots of cicadas, and then our numbers would, be decimated. So what we'll do is come out only like every 13 years or every 17 years, and then the predators eat as many cicadas as they can, but there's still more. All right, and so the cicadas, there's still enough to reproduce. And so every now and then there will be a year where, this is when all of the the cicadas are coming out, every 17 years. And I was hiking on the Appalachian Trail. There's one crawling on me. Okay. Some of the insects, especially ones we're going to start getting to, start experimenting with being social. All right, where it's for the good of the group. And in the social group, a lot of the individuals are sterile, very often sterile females, where you'd think most biological organisms you're trying to pass along your genes. But in a lot of these colonies, no, we want the colony to be successful. Only the queen gets to reproduce. We're here just kind of to defend and to burrow through the wood. And so termites would be one example um, of that. I do want to get to the butterflies. We're getting there soon. But if we were to start looking at fossils and looking at all the relationships between all of the different groups, and ask the question like, where do butterflies come from? Well, there's a lot to say on that. But there are extinct fossil groups and living groups where you'd notice, ooh, they start to have some of the traits of the butterflies. Like they start to have wing scales. That's actually what Lepidoptera means. It means scale wing. And so here's, a caddisfly cousin that starts to have scales on its wings. And so, all of these interesting minor groups. One of the things they might do is, let's like slowly start to piece together, where these groups come from. Okay. Grasshoppers are pretty more of the primitive group. So like before the dinosaur age, there were grasshoppers around of the order Orthoptera. All right, and we certainly have a bunch of different ones around here. All right. So here's one of our grasshoppers that you'd find in Orange County. Here's another grasshopper. We find katydids. All right. We'll get to them when we talk about ovipositors. You can find camel crickets. These are largely nocturnal. And so now that we're in insects, we put insects into these little groups called orders. So dragonflies and damselflies, they would be one order, Odonata. The grasshoppers and all their friends, they would be in a different order, Orthoptera. All right, and so, and getting back to that identifying insects thing, there aren't really experts, at least not that I know, in like insect identification. You tend to specialize. And like if you were to go to a museum, like it's like, I'm a grasshopper guy, and you're a butterfly person, and you're a beetle person or something. And a lot of people, you're not even a beetle person, you're like this group of beetle person. There's just so many of them. And if you're going to specialize on looking under the microscope and at this segment of their legs and doing this, you can't do that for all of the groups. So there's just so many of them that we tend to specialize. One group is called Hemiptera, right? And they tend to have sucking mouths. Most of them live in the water, all right? But every now and then you can see some on land. So this is an ambush bug. It looks like a flower, like it's kind of colorful. Its body is kind of like petal shaped, etc. But it's just sitting there with these big arms, just hoping to find a bug that comes to pollinate the flower, and it'll grab it. Even bees, like they'll go after bees as well. Spotted lanternflies, you were hearing some of the song. They belong to this group. And that's why they're dangerous to our plants, because they suck the sap. They have these sucking mouth parts, which is typical of the group Hemiptera, especially if you have orchards or fruit trees, just the spotted lanternfly sucking all the sap, that's a problem. We can see some of them on land. The small milkweed bug is one of them. All right. Now, we'll get into this again, but you see how brightly colored it is? Usually that's a sign that says, hey, I'm poisonous. Predators learn my coloration pattern, so you avoid me from this point on. So milkweeds, we familiar that monarch caterpillars eat the milkweed, they absorb the toxins, and that's why predators will tend to avoid the monarchs. Well, they're not the only one who figured that out. There's a bunch of bugs which have specialized that they can eat milkweed. Milkweeds are poisonous to most things, but they can eat milkweeds, and then they advertised, just like the monarch is brightly colored, and said, hey, don't eat me because I'm poisonous. Here's a bug in a different group of insects that's the same thing. So a lot of them do occur on land, but a lot of them are aquatic, like giant water bugs. All right, so there's different kinds. Some are bigger than others, but some get really big. All right, and they can then go after small fish. They can even go after baby ducks. All right, so these are pretty big. If you look at the little two things coming out of its abdomen, they also are breathing through their butts. If you ask, like, how can an insect breathe underwater? There's a whole bunch of ways. Like if you're a beetle, you could like grab a bubble of air and put it under your hardened wing and like carry it down with you. You could have like little bristles that stick up that are oily so that like water bubbles will trap. But a bunch will then just have a long breathing tube that they can take oxygen in. So these water scorpions are like that. So if you're a water scorpion, you got this long breathing tube. You're like a little praying mantis that's like hanging upside down, waiting for a little fish to come by. And you can breathe because you got this long tube going to the surface of the water. Some live on the surface of the water, like water striders, hunting for things there. And there's more. There's a whole bunch in the water. This one, these are sometimes called water bees. This one and another one. I've run afoul of these guys. So like if you're ever messing around in muck, you're like, oh, let me look or whatever. All of a sudden you feel like a bee stung you, and not like a mild bee sting, but like it really hurts. These guys are often the culprits. There's another one that got me when I was doing a demo at an environmental center a year ago. These guys. So, when you're playing around with water bugs, some of them just they have these sucking mouth parts that they can kind of like stab you with. So that's a group Hemiptera. Now, I think that if we were to like say a few words about remaining insect groups, we're down to the big four, I think, where 4 groups of insects have as many species as all other types of life combined as of now. So if you were put, plants, fungi, all of the other things together, the beetles, the flies, the moths, and the wasps, they outnumber everybody else. So these are diverse groups. So just a little salute to these 4, and then, that'll kind of wrap up, I guess the invertebrates. So beetles, like the others, their larvae don't look like beetles. So beetles don't come out of eggs. Instead, you've got these things which, have very few legs, maybe only on the front of their body, that will live in rotting wood. Right. Now, we're going to talk about wasps in a second. So beetles, they're everywhere, and there's a gazillion kinds, and they all start life out like this. So we're going to get to the wasps, because most wasps,
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm sorry, someone, I think I'm just going to mute. If you've got a comment, feel free to throw it in the chat. There are wasps who are kind of like
Oh, you got me.
Oh, Megumi,
yeah,
do you have a
right
question?
now is okay. Right now is okay.
Just like, that movie Alien, where like, they'll put their eggs inside people, and like the person is just like this toast as they're slowly digested from the inside. Most wasps do that. And if you ask who do they do it to, most of them do it to beetle larvae. So we'll get back to that. All right. But there's lots of beetle larvae in decomposing wood, and then that comes up later. There's a plant called dogbane. And we mean it. Like if you have dog bane on your property and you have a dog, you should cut it down. All right, because if your dog eats it, like they can get really sick. Like it's called dog bane for a reason. Plants often have poisons to stop animals from eating them. And so milkweed has them, dog bane has them. So, it's called dog bane for a reason. But here's what's called the dog bane beetle. Just like there are some, things which eat milkweed and ingest their toxins, dog bane is a toxic plant. So here's a beetle that's ingesting the toxins from that plant. And look, also, look how shiny it looks. It's advertising for predators. Hey, remember me, don't eat me. Here's a beetle that eats milkweed. And once again, look how red it is. Once again, it's saying predators, remember me, don't eat me. Okay. There are so many kinds of beetles. I remember, not to go into religious themes, but there was like about 100 years ago, there was this biologist who was a great naturalist or whatever. And someone once asked him, like, what has all your studies told you about God? All right. And his answer was, he was awfully fond of beetles. All right, and there are just so many kinds. And so here is one we could find in our area, a boring beetle. This is a long-haired horn flower beetle. All right, we've got all of the ladybugs. Dung beetles have existed forever. In the Jurassic period, they were messing around with the dung of like big dinosaurs, like the sauropods, and here they are messing around with the dung of mammals alive today. There are beetles that go after the dead, like the carrion beetles. All right, there are beetles that live underwater and various kinds of diving beetles. Whirligigs, they're so good that they kind of skim around on the top of water, and they've duplicated their eyes. So they have two pairs of eyes. These are here to look above to see if there's any predators, above the water. But the other one is underwater looking for food. So they've got two pairs of eyes, and they can kind of be underwater and above water at the same time. Okay. So that would be the one that's facing up. That would be the one that's facing down. So there are beetles everywhere. And then there are moths everywhere. And you say, don't you mean butterflies? Butterflies are modified moths. Almost all of the members of the group are moths. We'll get to butterflies. I mean, butterflies are cool, but moths come first, and most of the group are moths. The name Lepidoptera means scale wing. So if you could take a butterfly or moth wing and look under the microscope, you'd see all these little fluffy scales that are good for keeping warm. They help fly. Also, like if you hit a spider web, all right, it could like maybe catch some of the scales and you would get away, all right, because they can dislodge. All right, so butterflies and moths, that's one of their features. They can be thin or they have all of these little scales, or we have all of these options. And obviously, some have these big eye spots. So when they suddenly fly away, whoever's going to try to eat the butterfly thinks this thing with big eyes is coming after it and gets startled and gives them a chance to go away. This group evolved in stages. We think of the long proboscis that they can use for to get nectar. But the earliest members don't have that. They just kind of have like regular old mouth parts. So moths alive today have mouths that look like this, primitive ones. All right, and then it was later that the group would develop the typical proboscis. All right, so moths are incredibly diverse. And this makes up the majority of the group. So if you were to do a family tree, which I do somewhere, a family tree. All right. So in a second, the family tree. Right. So if we were to start here, so this would be the family tree, lots of groups of insects. These would be all of the different groups of moths, and then butterflies, this would be their lineage. All right, so order Lepidoptera, has butterflies. We like them because they're pretty. But there's so many different kinds of moths. You can tell the difference. All right, not all moths come out at night. There's some that come out in the day. Some are colorful. But one easy way is the antenna. All right, butterflies tend to have thin antennae that end in a club, whereas moths have, so that's a butterfly. Look at the antenna. Moths have more of a feathery antenna. All right, now with the great surface area, it can detect all of these molecules, including pheromones. They can detect like the opposite gender of their species from like 7 miles away, which is not only impressive, but especially if you're going to come out at night. All right, that's not a bad not a bad thing. In the butterflies, one of the interesting things that happens here is there's kind of like a higher group of them called Ditricia that decide, you know what? Hey, and this is just the way you know them. Hey, you know what most insects do? Uh, um, uh, Females have one opening on their abdomen that's both for the digestive tract for defecation, but also for reproduction. Here's a thought. Let's not do that. Let's have two openings. So unlike most insects, they decide, hey, let's do two openings. One's for egg laying. All right, and this one, oh, and I'm sorry, and there's I mixed that up. There is a separate one for the digestive tract. This one's for sex. So instead of having eggs leave the body through the same opening that sperm came in, they actually now have two separate pores, which makes this group unique. And then when we look at moths or when we look at butterflies, we can now separate them into groups. All right, so this group of butterflies, they have this traits, and like this would be an example of this member. Well, we have the swallowtails. That's a member of this group. This group is most represented in the neotropics, etc. And so there's just all of these groups of these things. And in our area, we find both. All right, so we can see butterflies and moths. Most of the caterpillars you've ever seen are moths. Once again, like the group moths dominate. So when you see caterpillars, they're almost always moths. We don't see as many butterflies. So that was a moth. This was a moth. Okay. And then obviously there's all of the different groups of butterflies, and each one tells its own story, like, how many generations it takes for monarch butterflies to migrate here and that whole life cycle. I have a video on that. You can get, generation 1 is here, and then, at this month, generation 2 gets over to here, and then generation 3 goes up to here, etc. So fascinating group. 2 more groups. Okay. The order Hymenoptera has a number of things. We're going to start off with the wasps. Now, where did wasps come from? All right, and why the stinger? Well, the interesting thing is there are things called sawflies, which have a lengthened ovipositor. I have a video on that, and it's going to come up again. But you see this thing here? That's to lay eggs. Sometimes when you want to lay eggs, you want to put it just where you want to. And so females have this lengthened structure at the tip of their abdomen called an ovipositor. This cricket does, all right? Lots of animals do. In fact, like grasshoppers have it because like the ovipositor can like maybe saw a little hole in a plant. So now there's a little hole and you put your egg in there and it'll be safe. All right, so there's the ovipositor, a little saw that can make a hole. And here, these dragonflies, I want to put my egg just here. All right, so females can have a lengthened ovipositor so that they can be picky about where they put their eggs. And you can see it on the sawtail. Here, this female is being picky. All right. Well, most wasps, they use their ovipositor that way. So most wasps can't sting you. All right. They have an ovipositor that is meant to lay it inside like a beetle larva or some other insect so that they can then, their young then develop inside that, that prey. And coming up, I swear, I have to find my wasp. Where's the, where'd you go? All right, so there's a really cool one on that. So, but for example, here's a wasp that's paralyzing a spider. It's going to lay its egg. It doesn't want to kill the spider. All right, it just wants to paralyze it. All right, and so it's going to lay its eggs inside, and then the baby wasp, just like caterpillars go through a larval stage and then undergo metamorphosis, the babies are going to go develop inside the spider there. If you were to see this wasp, all right, I think a lot of you would be terrified. Like, I don't want that thing to sting me, but it can't. All right, that's not what its ovipositor is for. It knows that there are beetle larvae in decaying wood. So if it's on a rotten log that's got like all these little holes, the female is going to stick its abdomen inside all the little holes and just kind of feel around, where is there a beetle larva? And when it finds it, it's going to sting it and lay its egg inside, so that now the beetle larvae slowly gets eaten from inside by the fly larva. And so this is what most wasps do. And they tend to be very, very specific to their prey. And so there's like an incredible number of species that we know nothing about. Right, so there's all of these species of wasps that they're the parasitic group, closely matched to their prey, a lot in the tropics. And just once again, of the 4 biggest groups of species in the world, wasps are among them. But from the wasps, we get the stinging social wasps, which we know, but then we also get bees and ants. Ants are wasps, which just kind of lost their stingers, although the first fossil ants still have their stingers, and most lost their ability to fly. So bees are descended from wasps. And when we deal with social stuff, among the wasps, many are solitary. Some are semi-social, like they sometimes hang out in groups, and then some hang out in big groups. When we look at the bees, same thing. Like bumblebees, they're social, but not as social as honeybees. All right, so there's a bunch of different kinds of those. Carpenter bees, same thing. So social activities in this group, there's all different kinds. Obviously, the honeybee is introduced and is a great help with us with pollination. But we have lots of bees, including little tiny ones, which we call sweat bees. There's a whole bunch of those. So if you look very closely, you'll see all these little, these are bees which live in our area, or just, smaller. They're solitary. They don't hang out in the big groups that that we know. Of the bigger wasps, the cicada killer wasp, once again, it loves cicadas. Who doesn't? All right, and so here you see it. It's paralyzed a cicada, and it's going to carry it to a burrow. We're just going to kind of keep it paralyzed so that its babies can develop inside of its. So it's just going to keep putting paralyzed cicadas into its burrow and lay more eggs that they can develop inside. Oh, so that's an excellent question. So there are different kinds of cicadas. Some are here all the time. And so like that video was not in a boom year for cicadas. So that was not the periodic cicada. I think it's called magic cicada. That was just normal cicadas, which aren't on the 13 or 17-year cycle. Yeah, good question. Yeah, I thought the same thing. And then obviously then some of the wasps have become social, coming out in big groups with a complex social structure with queens. Most of the stinging wasps are sterile females. So there's lots of ways of determining gender for the next generation. This group, they do it by whether the eggs are fertilized. So the queen makes an egg, all right? If it's not fertilized, it develops into a female. If it's not fertilized, it develops into a male. If it is fertilized, it develops into a female. And most of the wasps you see are these sterile females, which are now going to defend the nest and feed the young, etc. So I've got more on the different kinds of wasps. But a quick shout out to the very last group is the flies. So flies, like all of the groups I just said, they're Cretaceous. So around the time of the dinosaurs, that's when we get the first beetles, the first moths, the first wasps, and the first flies. The first flies have 2 pairs of wings, but then that changed. And so unlike most flies, which have, most insects have 2 pairs of wings, they have 1 pair of wings, and then the second one is now a set of balancing structures called halteres. So that makes them really good at flying, because they've modified that second pair of wings. Here on the screenfly, you can see it's really exaggerated, but you can see that on any group of flies here. Once again, they don't have flies pop out of their eggs, but rather larvae that look rather like worms. We tend to call them maggots. There are different kinds of flies in there, and there are different kinds of fly larvae. Some have prominent heads. Like, look, that's a prominent head. Many of these are aquatic. But if you were to look at like fruit fly larvae, you don't really see the prominent head, and they tend to be terrestrial. So you could like split the adults into group based on their features, but you could do the same to these flies as well. I'm partial to fruit flies because as I'm sure many of you are, we've learned so much about human genes by studying a simpler animal and then applying what we've learned to humans, right? So, we like flies for that reason. But then again, there's lots of different kinds of flies. So here's a fly in our area. Flies can undergo pollination. And some of them you don't even think are flies. Some of them you think are bees. So I'm sure you're like, oh, look at that bee. That's not a bee. That's a fly. It's a fly that looks like a bee because predators leave it alone. All right. But, there are a lot of flies in our area, obviously important for decomposing, but then obviously important for disease as well. When we think about mosquitoes, malaria will kill, 500,000 people this year. Zika virus may cause, pregnant women to give birth to infants whose skulls are small with small brains and permanent neurological defects as a result. And so clearly these are important, and I just love these bloodworms. There's midges. Some of them bite, some of them don't. All right, and so there's clearly a large number of flies in the world. All right, so as we try to just get an appreciation of the great life around us. I mean, like I like looking at birds, because look, the males look different from the females, and look, they've got a juvenile phase that looks different. But so many of the dragonflies, oh look, that's the green one. The females are green, the males are blue. All right, a lot of the males and females look different. And oh look, this is the larva that lives underwater. You just like a lot of the same things we appreciate about birds and some of these other things we can see in these invertebrates. And just they outnumber us in terms of number of species, in terms of just sheer biomass, and they came first. So animals did a lot of their early experimentation with these invertebrates. They were the ones that invented the brain. They were the ones that invented vision. They were the ones that invented a complete digestive tract. And the vertebrates would just kind of take what they had developed and then just add on to it. All right. So there's just so many reasons to be interested in all of these invertebrates. And even if you don't care, if you say, no, I still like my birds, I still like my other wildlife. Well, I mean, there's food chains, right? So, what are your birds eating? Like all of, so there's just so many reasons to gain an appreciation for these invertebrates. And there's really only one group that I've skipped. But that group we could tie into next week because fish had to come from somewhere. All right, so for a long time there were invertebrates, but there were no vertebrates, and then all of a sudden there were vertebrates. Where did they come from? So we'll start off with invertebrates at the beginning of the next lecture, and then go into the fish, and then the great diversity of fish which we have in Orange County. If anyone has any questions, great, I'd be happy to answer them. For all you who are here, thank you so much for coming. Anything I can help you with? Any questions?
Sure.
Yeah.
How much did varying oxygen levels affect the size?
I think a lot. So I think the carboniferous, when there's the most oxygen in the air, they get the biggest. But that's also when the first amphibians were getting onto land at the first time. At first, amphibians just ate fish. That's what they did. Like they were like crocodile-y. But then I think at some point they started eating the bugs. And then not too long after, the vertebrates started to fly. You got the pterosaurs, which could now fly in the air and eat the bugs on the air. So I think bugs had land to themselves for a while, and then bugs had air to themselves for a while. And when that changed, I think that then kind of cut down on the sizes that they could reach. Yeah. So just as they steer and like kind of, navigate and orient themselves, they use the light of the moon. And so then just, they've been doing that since the Cretaceous period. So they've been doing it for 75 million years. Street lights are much younger than that, and they just haven't adapted to that yet. So we just kind of throw them off. Yeah.
You gave a little rule of thumb for telling a butterfly from a moth. Does that apply to their caterpillars as well?
So the antennae, none of the caterpillars have antennae. So that was the big one. I don't know of anyone where you can just like you can identify this one as this moth, but I don't know that you can clearly put them into two groups. I know a lot of the moths will tend to use silk as they make their cocoon, hence silk. I mean, that's where silk comes from, you know, like the silk moths are using this to weave. And that's why gypsy moth caterpillars are here. Someone had a great idea like, ooh, I'd get rich if I could now breed, you know, a type of moth that could make silk, you know, et cetera. And then they left the window open and they accidentally knocked a jar over, and now we have gypsy moths. So I don't know if it would be that, but to be honest, I mean, there's just so many moths, and there's like primitive ones you would only find like in tropical rainforests and different places. I certainly don't know moth caterpillars well enough that I could like, ooh, let me think of something, but I'm not sure that we do in general, right? Because there are so many species that we haven't identified yet. So right now, beetles outnumber everybody else, but flies might overtake them in the near future. Like when we say like, who's the biggest group? You know, beetles may not stay on top forever. All right, there's still lots of wasps we haven't identified, and lots of um, flies, etc. Well, have a wonderful evening.
Walter, I had a question.
Thank you. In the chat. Speaking of large bugs. What's the largest? Well, so the question here, what's the largest arthropod? There was a 12-foot long millipede. I think that's the biggest that I know of. Oh, I'm sorry. So, all right. So that in length, the 8-foot long sea scorpions. Well, no, actually, yeah, 8-foot long sea scorpions. We'd have to consider body mass, because if you're floating underwater, the water's helping to support your weight. So you might not have been as long, but you might have been heavier. So I think those would be the two. That really long millipede and the 8-foot long sea scorpions. I think they're the biggest. Good night, everyone.
No.